Our all-new Stories from Maine podcast will begin shortly.
Many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. In this episode, we will hear the story of one of Maine's greatest poets, a three-time Pulitzer Prize winner from Gardiner, Maine. Then, Oscar will tell us the story of one man's Maine-born dog, who became Hollywood's first superstar canine. And, with the Christmas holiday approaching, we will hear the historic tale of the very first Christmas ever celebrated in New England history, and it took place right here in Maine. Also, Rachel will be along to tell you about our all-new Stories from Maine store on eBay. We will also give a few updates on our plans for Stories from Maine in 2025. So, stay tuned while we launch this all-new, December episode of our Stories from Maine podcast. Our program begins right now.
This is the Stories from Maine podcast for December 1st, 2024. You can follow us at Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify. And Lori Suzanne Dell's books can be found on Amazon and through all major bookstores.
Many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. And since today's stories are the histories of tomorrow, our people, places, and the events of today can become the icons and legends of the future. This December 22nd is the birthday of one of America's greatest poets, a man from Gardiner, Maine. Let's go now to Oscar, who has this wonderful story.
He was prolific in his time and one of the most celebrated poets in American history. He is today also one of the more forgotten of the great poets of Maine. Edwin Arlington Robinson was born at Head Tide in Alna, Maine, on December 22nd of 1869, to Edward and Mary Elizabeth Robinson. Soon after his birth, the Robinson family moved to Gardiner, Maine, and they liked to vacation in Harpswell. It was there in Harpswell, while on vacation among the coastal tides, that Edwin's name would be chosen in a lottery held by a group of other vacationing women. One of three children, Robinson was educated locally at Mrs. William Morrell's private school in Gardiner, then at the area public school where Robinson graduated from Gardiner High School in 1888. Then, Edwin entered Harvard University 2 years later, but after just 2 years at Cambridge, Edwin withdrew from the ivy-covered institution and returned to his home in Maine. While at Harvard, the very first of his published poems had appeared in the Harvard Advocate, the university's own literary magazine. It was the start of something big for Edwin, even if the formal Ivy League education wasn't. Edwin was seen by some as a somewhat temperamental man who seemed bitter and withdrawn. Others found him witty and friendly. Robinson described his early life as being stark, dark, and unhappy. He suffered from hearing difficulties and troubled vision, which often made interactions difficult. Yet, Robinson held deep romantic affections for a young Farmingdale woman named Emma Shepherd. But Robinson was rejected by the woman, and she instead married Edwin's brother. It was a disappointment that Edwin would never forget. While at Gardiner, Robinson found a great deal of support for his poetical aspirations. There, in 1896, Edwin penned his first book, The Torrent and the Night Before, which he self-published with locally donated money. His works in the volume were seen as cleverly written, with a new twist that shed the old veil of classic poetry and explored a new and shortened form of modern verse. By 1897, Edwin's next book, The Children of the Night, was published and also found a positive reception, though not a wide audience. He wrote of the working class of people and of overcoming the difficulties of life. And he wrote often of a place he called Tilbury Town, which was a thinly veiled disguise for Edwin's hometown of Gardiner, Maine. The reference first appeared in the poem John Everell Down in the Torrent and the Night Before. By 1899, Edwin left Gardiner for New York City to work on becoming what he always dreamed of being, a working writer, and more specifically, a working poet. Now in New York, Edwin befriended other writers, artists, and musicians, and this creative social world fed his hungry soul. And in New York, Edwin found popularity he had not known back in Maine. He also worked diligently on his next manuscript of poetry. By 1902, his third book, Captain Craig and Other Poems, was published. Robinson's work was finding an audience and a following had begun. Yet, though popularity with his work was rising, his fortunes had not. Edwin, needing money to survive, took a job as a fare collector in the New York City subway system. For Edwin, his life seemed pointless, and he deemed himself to be a failure. But his life was about to change. By 1905, a copy of The Children of the Night had caught the eye of Kermit Roosevelt, who then introduced the book to his father. When President Theodore Roosevelt read the book, he immediately invited Robinson to visit the White House. Yet Robinson was forced to decline. Edwin had been living a life with little monies available to him, and his wardrobe had become tired and frayed, and his appearance left him embarrassed. Not having what he deemed to be suitable clothing for a White House visit, he felt he had no choice but to decline the invitation. Teddy Roosevelt then suggested Robinson to a New York publisher, and the president also provided Robinson a better-paying sinecure position, a type of financial honorarium, at the Customs House in New York. The position paid $2,000 a year, which now allowed Robinson a steady income while he continued writing. This sinecure was the only one ever issued by President Theodore Roosevelt. Robinson then wrote his fourth book in 1910, his fifth in 1916, and his sixth in 1917. Robinson had indeed become a working poet, and when his sinecure ended in 1913, his books were finally affording him a modest enough income. In 1922, Robinson's 10th book, Collected Poems, had won Robinson his first Pulitzer Prize for poetry, and he was also considered for the 1923 Pulitzer as well, but he was beaten out by another Maine poet, Edna St. Vincent Millay. His 1924 book, The Man Who Died Twice, won Edwin a second Pulitzer in 1925, and his 1927 book, Tristram, then won Robinson his third Pulitzer Prize by 1928. Robinson would go on to write another 12 books of poetry between 1928 and 1935, and his works had finally become widely popular and were considered as some of the best and most modern American poetry ever written. Although he enjoyed a few relationships with other talented women artists and writers, Edwin never married and had no known children. His want of Emma, his first and unrequited love, had never waned. By 1934, Edwin was considered one of the greatest poets in the world, but he was also a sick man, diagnosed with an advanced form of cancer. Edwin penned his final work, King Jasper, by the early spring of 1935. Then, on April 6th of that year, Edwin Arlington Robinson died at New York's Cornell Hospital. He was 65 years old. Edwin's remains were cremated and his ashes were returned to Maine. Though his parents and a brother had died, his old friends and former neighbors had not forgotten him. Even Emma, the love he could not forget, added flower petals to his urn. Edwin's ashes were interred in the family plot at the Oak Grove Cemetery in Gardiner, Maine. Today, Edwin Arlington Robinson is considered one of the greatest of all American poets. He was well regarded by his contemporaries, well received by readers, and well celebrated by scholars. His first Pulitzer Prize was awarded to him in 1922, and he went on to achieve a total of 3 of these coveted prizes in just 6 years' time. And Robinson wrote a total of 28 books of poetry and 2 stage plays, all within his impressive career. Edwin Arlington Robinson's great contributions to the world of poetry only adds to the rich and diverse record of many of the greatest names in literature. And today, 89 years since his passing, Maine's great poet, Edwin Arlington Robinson, is remembered as one of our greatest and more successful of our literary stories from Maine.
Would you like to be a contributor to the Stories from Maine podcast? We are currently looking for segment personalities in a number of categories. If you would like to know more, or if you have an idea for your segment, send us an email at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com and tell us about your idea, or ask for our present list of wanted segment contributors. Remember, that's storiesfrommaine@gmail.com. Laurie Suzanne Dell's books, Stories from Maine, and Stories from Maine 2, The Legends Continue, and all of her books, are available through all major bookstores and through Amazon. And you can follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify.
This next tale is for all of the dog lovers out there, a story of another Maine first in American history. Let's go back now to Oscar to hear the tale of Gene, the Vitagraph dog, a Maine pup who became Hollywood's first superstar canine.
In 1909, one very special Maine dog became the very first canine to ever have a starring film role in American movie history. And this special Hollywood star was born in Down East, Maine. This special pooch was owned by a Maine man who became a silent film actor, writer, producer, and director of films starring his Maine dog. Lawrence Norwood Trimble was born to John and Maria Trimble at Robbinston, Maine, on February 15th of 1885. Trimble was locally educated, and he grew to become a freelance writer who specialized in animal stories, which he submitted for publication to magazines such as The American Boy. Trimble soon became friends with an assistant director at the Vitagraph Film Studios in Brooklyn, New York, while on a writing assignment. It was there in Brooklyn that Trimble learned that silent films were in need of a dog who could act. And Trimble was certain that Gene, who was born in Eastport, Maine in 1902, could be easily trained to act. The very next day, Trimble returned to the Vitagraph studio with Gene, who tried out for the part. Gene was an immediate hit with both the cast and the studio executives. Trimble and Gene were both signed on with Vitagraph Studios, and both Gene and Lawrence appeared together in their first film, Saved by the Flag, in 1910. Immediately, the Vitagraph studio executives saw an opportunity with Gene and Lawrence. Trimble was quickly hired on as Vitagraph's newest film director and given his own film crew to shoot a series of new movies starring America's first canine movie sensation, Trimble's own, Gene the Vitagraph dog. For the next 6 years, Lawrence and Gene made more than 25 films, where Gene was the top-billed star, and Trimble was the behind-the-scenes writer, producer, bit-part actor, and director. Gene's films were given top theatrical marquee names such as Gene and the Calico Doll, Gene Goes Fishing, Gene Intervenes, and Gene and the Waif. Gene was so popular with fans that they demanded to know more about their favorite silver screen pooch, who became more commonly known as Gene the Wonder Dog. Then in 1913, a documentary short film was made about Gene to give her fans more information about their favorite canine. The documentary was titled Gene and Her Family. Between 1913 and 1916, Gene and Trimble had left the Vitagraph soundstage in Brooklyn and traveled across the pond to make films under the Turner Films label in Great Britain. But the dangers of World War I forced Trimble to bring Gene back to America. Gene had acted with top billing in all of her films, despite having acted alongside top-rated actors such as Florence Turner, Helen Costello, Charles Kent, Mary Fuller, Ralph Ince, Leo Delaney, and a very young new child actress named Helen Hayes. And Gene became a favorite not only in the United States but also in Great Britain and much of Europe. Gene's popularity had opened a new category of films in Hollywood, and soon, other dogs were also finding their way onto the silver screen, with names such as Bobby the Wonder Dog, Jim the Wonder Dog, and many others. However, in 1916, although Gene had achieved American superstardom as the original Wonder Dog, and had achieved a great deal of international stardom as well, she had also achieved her old age. By late summer of 1916, At the advanced age of 14, Gene the Wonder Dog had passed away. Trimble had wanted to retire from filmmaking, but he was talked into continuing. Trimble then tried with a few other dogs after Gene's passing, but he never quite found the pup with the right stuff. Within a few years, Trimble discovered a German-born German Shepherd named Strongheart, and Trimble soon made 4 movies with Strongheart between 1921 and 1925. But Trimble's heart was not in these projects. He soon retired from the filmmaking business in 1926, and then he worked for the rest of his life training dogs for films and as guide dogs for the blind. Then on February 8th of 1954, at the age of 68, Lawrence Trimble died near Los Angeles in California, and his ashes were interred at the Chapel of the Pines Crematorium in Los Angeles. As for Gene, her legacy in Hollywood had been forever cemented in the memory of her fans and in the celluloid legends of Tinseltown. Her work had paved the way for future canine stars such as Rin Tin Tin, Lassie, and even that ring-eyed little rascal named Petey. Shortly before Lawrence had died, he gave an interview where he described Gene the Wonder Dog as being the greatest dog he ever had and the best dog he had ever worked with. For America, Gene had become the first canine superstar in American history. For the Pine Tree State, Gene had become one of the most prideful of our star-studded canine stories from Maine.
You can follow us at Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify. And Lori Suzanne Dell's books can be found on Amazon and through all major bookstores. Now, you can also find new autographed copies of Lori Suzanne Dell's books available for purchase in our all-new Stories from Maine eBay store, while supplies last. And you can also find our all-new Maine-made Stories from Maine coaster set and our Stories from Maine Christmas tree ornament, just in time for the holidays. Head on over to our Facebook page at facebook.com/Stories from Maine and click on the eBay link at the top left-hand corner of our page. Or you can search for us on eBay at Stories from Maine.
In last month's November podcast, you heard the story of the legend of America's first Thanksgiving, likely held at the Popham Colony in Phippsburg, Maine, in 1607. Now, Oscar returns to tell you the story of the first known Christmas ever celebrated in New England, which took place 3 years before the celebration of Thanksgiving at Popham. So, let's go back to Oscar for this next legend of another first in Maine history.
In June of 1604, 16 years before the arrival of the Pilgrims at Plymouth, a band of 130 French explorers landed on Holy Cross Island, also known as Little St. Croix Island, in the wilderness of Acadia, at the mouth of the St. Croix River, between present-day New Brunswick, Canada, and Calais, Maine. Here, on this little island, in what is now Washington County, Maine, the first Christmas celebration in New England history had taken place. These French Christian settlers were authorized under King Henry IV of France to build the first settlement on the Maine coast. Famed explorer Samuel de Champlain took part in this settlement and wrote of the events and people there on Little St. Croix Island. This hodgepodge of assorted company comprised of Catholic priests and Huguenot ministers, ruffians and thieves, nobles, sailors, and men of education and means. These settlers arrived to spread Catholicism and Protestantism, and to open a trade route with the many tribes of Wapanaki natives, and to map the areas and navigate the waterways. They cut wood, beat back brush, and carve out a small settlement where they would harvest their needs from the surrounding waters and wilderness lands. There were no women or children with these French settlers, who immediately cut down trees, built tight, warm cabins, each complete with fireplaces and sleeping quarters. They fished the sea and harbors, hunted the land, trapped the rivers, and stored their bounty in the food storage shelters they erected. These French Catholics and Protestants also traded with the Wapanaki for pelts and furs for use as clothing and bedding. And while these settlers feasted on the beasts, birds, and fish, the island's primary inhabitants feasted upon the settlers These mosquito and black flies annoyed excessively, Champlain wrote. Several of our men's faces were so swollen by bites, they could scarcely see. Though a successful settlement in comparison to that of the many English settlers who would follow in the later years, many also fell to illness and disease. Scurvy, a severe deficiency of vitamin C, is believed to have killed 20 of this nearly 80 band of settlers. Before winter had arrived, more than 40 of these men had already sailed back to France, uninterested in braving the oncoming winter. Yet, nearly 80 of these adventuresome explorers, content to remain on Little St. Croix Island, settled in for a brusque winter. When the bitter cold and heavy snows of winter had arrived in late December of 1604, these hardy colonists focused on their Christian faith and traditions, which was a part of their daily lives. These settlers had built a chapel and had decorated this house of worship with boughs of spruce and berries, and wreaths of fir and dried flowers. They likely had a nativity scene also displayed with reverent care. It was the practice of these Catholic and Protestant men to observe the birth of Jesus Christ, and the accompanying clergy who lived on the island directed the men in prayer and reverent thought leading up to the Christmas Day festivities. Although no women or children were present, these settlers celebrated a happy holiday together. When Christmas Day arrived, on December 25th of 1604, they began their day with a dawn service of prayers and homilies, and gave thanks for their health and well-being. There was food stored in abundance, very little sickness remained, and they all had adequate housing and fuel for warmth. Aside from prayers and psalms, came the telling of the story of the star in the east, the 3 wise men, the manger in the stable, and Mary and Joseph, all which lead to the origin of the King of Kings, the birth of Jesus Christ. Later in the day, a merry and festive celebration was prepared with a grand feast laid out before these men. Although the younger of the group likely enjoyed some physical activity or early sports or other recreations, the elder of these men remained indoors, seated around a warming fire, talking of France, their king, and all manner of future plans. By January of 1605, as a more harsh portion of winter covered the Little St. Croix Island settlement, with deep snows and rivers sealed under thick ice, sickness began to once again invade the colony. Pneumonia was no doubt present, and the dreaded scurvy had returned. Stores of dried firewood had been depleted, and their once ample food store was now a bare cupboard of crumbs and memories. By March, new settlers arrived from France to redouble the colonist numbers for expanding King Henry's colony. But this new band of explorers had discovered that only a small settlement of men remained. 35 of the remaining original settlers had died during the winter, including both the Catholic priest and the Protestant minister. Yet, these men had a great deal of work to do to help spread the empire of King Henry IV of France. While snow and ice melted away, and the green of spring arose from the thawing ground, exploration of the rivers, streams, and shorelines continued, as mapping of these explored areas began again. Before the next winter had arrived, the colony on Little St. Croix Island was eventually abandoned, and these settlers were moved to Port Royal at Nova Scotia, where they settled once again. But their time on Little St. Croix Island had left a great history for a country that would one day rise from desperation and dare to free itself from tyranny. And with the true story of the first Christmas in New England, held on Little St. Croix Island, in what is now Washington County in the great state of Maine, we may observe our own Christmas celebrations and remember these early French colonists who have left to us one of the more reverent of our stories from Maine.
You can follow Stories from Maine on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, and Facebook at Stories from Maine. And you can get Laurie Suzanne Dell's book through booksellers everywhere and through Amazon. In the coming new year, we will bring you more of Maine's legendary tales, heroic stories, and incredible legends through our posts on Facebook, videos on YouTube, and through our podcasts. Our Stories from Maine newspaper columns shall continue to appear in the weekend issues of the Times Record as well. And our next podcast will stream on January 1st of 2025. Also, Lori Suzanne Dell's next book, Stories from Maine 3, will publish in May of 2025. In the meantime, you can find all of Lori's books through book retailers, from Amazon, and through our Stories from Maine store on eBay. So, have a very Merry Christmas and the happiest of New Years. Thanks for listening.